Hey guys, welcome back to the JamieBot channel. Today I want to talk about 5 best practices for Angular, and these will really help you be more productive as a programmer, as well as just overall make you more sane. I wrote that here, productivity and sanity, and that's because a lot of the time when you're programming, you don't know what you should do, but this will kind of give you some basic rules to help you just make the right decision in the long term. All right, so let's get into it. Oh, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. I release new content fairly frequently, so you don't want to miss out on that. Plus, it really helps support the channel. I'd really appreciate that. Alright, moving on. The first tip I have for productivity in Angular is to generate classes. Okay, so gone are the days from Angular 1 where you had to type all those files manually. Alright, for this quick example, I just want to generate a new project in the folder I'm in. My YouTube folder, so I type ng new and the name of the project, Angular Best Practices. So I'll press enter there, and then it'll just ask me a series of questions. Sure, I want routing. I like to use SCSS for the styling. So you can see how just with this one command, it's generating all these files, so it saves a lot of time. And then you can do that for components as well. So you don't want to add new files manually, you just want to just generate them almost always. It's just a lot faster and a lot less error prone. Okay, so I've opened up my project in VS Code, and then I just want to show you how to generate a component just like I was talking about. You just do ng space g, and then the third argument can be one of many things. I'll just press enter so that it will tell me what those things are. Have a bunch of them: app shell, application, class, component. Bunch of stuff. Main ones you're going to use are component, and then maybe like a service. Okay, so I'm just going to generate a new component, like I was mentioning, ng space g space c, and then I usually like to put it in the components folder, components, and then I'll just call it home, and that's just so that I can organize it into components, providers, and so forth, just to keep it a little bit more organized. So you can see it generated all those files for me. Huge time saver. Also, you can see that the name of the selector is home as well, app-home. So you can see that the name is just really sticky. So changing these files manually is kind of a pain. So I always just suggest generating them. It's a lot faster. Okay, so now let's get back. I'm going to show you the next tip. Next tip is to avoid duplicate code. And there are several different flavors or types of duplicate code in Angular. The first one is going to be HTML duplicate code. So if you have code that's the same in two different components, but the code is in the HTML, then what you can do is actually make a new component, and then you can just add that component selector in the HTML in both places. So I'm going to show you an example of that. So let's say for some reason I have these 3 headers, which I always just repeat. Whenever I have them, I just repeat them like this. If I'm doing this multiple times, then I can just put this into its own component. I'm just going to call this one sequence. That's the name of the component, which I'm going to refactor the code into. So I'm just going to cut this out and then go and put it inside of the sequence file. So 1, 2, 3 is in there, and then inside of sequence ts, it says that app-sequence is the selector name. So inside of the HTML, instead of writing 1, 2, 3, you can just write app sequence, and that's its own tag, so it'll work just like that. So you can see that this is a lot less code right here, albeit there's probably a lot more code total because of the TS file, which is basically empty. But the more code there is, the more this pays off. There's a little bit of overhead with generating a new class, but if the thing you're repeating is larger and even has some additional functionality, maybe clicking on the numbers does something, then you'll definitely want to refactor it like this, because you just change it once and then it works in all the places where you're using that. Alright, the next type of duplicate code is for TypeScript. If there's duplicate logic, then and the logic goes in the TS file, by the way, then the logic can be refactored into like a separate function or even a provider. So let's say that in the home component, I need to have a variable count or something set equal to 0 initially, and then in the onInit function, let's say that for some reason I need to process the count, and let's just say that I also need to do this inside of the sequence file for some reason. Let's say it has its own count equals, maybe theirs is 1. And then, yeah, in the onInit I need to do some operations. And this is kind of a silly example because you wouldn't really want to abstract this small amount of code. But just to illustrate, imagine that this operation is much more complex. If I'm doing it in multiple places, what I can actually do is I can generate a service. We'll just call it the number provider. And with services, you actually need to nest it twice. The first one is the folder name, and then the second one is the name of the actual provider class. Yeah, so I have this service, and then I'm going to declare that functionality in here a single time. So take this logic, and we're just going to go and put it in a function in the service, just called process or something like that. And then we'll say it takes a parameter count. So this is the more generic version of the code, and then we return count over here. So now this logic has been abstracted, but in order to use that service, I need to actually go in here to the providers array in the module file, and then add it down here, number service. So just import that, and then inside of any class I want to use it, namely the sequence was one of them, inject it like this, private number service, number service. Okay, and then in the onInit, instead of doing that operation, I can just say this dot count equals this dot number service dot process this dot count. Okay, and so that'll perform the same operation, and if that's a lengthy operation, then it's great to refactor it like this, because then when you have it in two places, you only have to change it once, and then your life will be a lot easier, basically. Again, you don't want to do this for everything, just things that are just so annoyingly large that you don't want to change it in multiple places all the time. So you'll definitely know if you want to make that sort of refactor. Okay, and then the last type of duplicate code is just CSS. So let's say that in the home I want to style the paragraph tag to be color red or something like that. And then in the app component, let's say that I also have a paragraph tag, which I want to style as well. Well, instead of doing this, declaring the style here, both here and here, you could refactor it to be in the styles.css, which is global styles. And again, you only want to do this if the style is very consistent and it's true across the entire app. But if you do find something that you realize is a global style, then put it in this styles.scss instead of declaring it multiple times. That way your life will just be easier. Right, let's code. Yeah, so that's global styles as far as avoiding duplicate code. Alright, next tip I have for you guys is avoiding magic values. And this is just so that your code is easier to read and easier to configure. So let's say you have this set timeout function, and then inside of there you console log something, and then the delay on the set timeout is 2 seconds. Well, 2 seconds is kind of what's called a magic number or a magic value. And if someone is reading that code, they might not know why it's 2 seconds instead of like 5 seconds. Like why? What's so special about 2 seconds? So oftentimes what people do is they declare a class variable. So like in the second bullet point here, it's called initial delay. And then so they set the initial delay to whatever that value was. In this case, I just made it a little bit more clear, 2 times 1,000. That's kind of more easy to tell that it's 2 seconds because the value for set timeout is in milliseconds. 1,000 milliseconds is a second. And so 2 times 1,000 is going to be 2 seconds. So it's just easier to read that way. But you can see that we're using that same variable in the set timeout function below that, this dot initial delay. And so what's happened here is I've actually given the value a name, which is the variable name, and that's just a lot more descriptive, and it'll help other people reading your code, including yourself later, like if you're ever looking back on your code. It'll help you like understand what's going on better. You don't always need to do that, but just for variables that are more prominent, especially if you're using that value multiple times, then that's a really big indicator, because then if you want to change that value, it'll just be like a lot easier for you. Okay, next tip I have for you guys is to not overcomplicate. The rules which I've been telling you in this are kind of loose rules, like you only do it if you think you need to do it. And so I decided to dedicate an entire slide to this one. Don't overcomplicate it. Like there's this famous example online of like a repository on GitHub where there's a simple hello world program, like a program that only prints hello world, but they like followed all these design patterns, and they increased the code length to like I think thousands of lines of code, maybe even tens of thousands of lines of code. And the only thing that the program does is print hello world. But they're following all these best practices sort of things, but they're just kind of being ridiculous in like the way that they're applying these practices. So these practices are meant to help you, so only use them if you think it's going to be a speed up for you. Like if you notice you're constantly changing the same similar types of code in 2 files, then abstract it into a component or a service. Just to keep it simple, like when you're designing it, you often don't know what you're building until you've built it. That's what the second point here is. Build one to throw it away. That's a phrase meaning like while you're building, you figure out things that you didn't know before, and so like once you've built it, you know like now how to design it, but you didn't originally. And so it's important, as the first bullet point says, to organize and refactor as time goes on. Don't try and like project into the future too far. It'll just kind of make your life a lot harder. So just follow your gut. Don't overcomplicate it. And then last tip I have for you guys is testing later. This one's gonna sound kind of weird, but especially if you're like building your own project for for fun, or for maybe you're trying to make a business or something. It's important to keep in mind that not all projects succeed, and since tests are kind of like duplicate code in a way, like you're sort of like mimicking the functionality of the code in tests, at least partially. And so if a project doesn't work, then you've just kind of duplicated the code, and so now you have like twice as much code that doesn't work. So it's really pointless. So especially if you're an entrepreneur or something like that, I would leave the tests to very last until you know that your product is wanted, at the very least. I mean, if you're building rockets or something, you should probably write test code, but like mostly what I teach on the channel is like Angular front-end code, and so for Angular, the front end is never going to be secure anyway, so like any test that you write, they're all just kind of to make sure that nothing breaks. If you have a huge project, you just want to make sure that changing something doesn't break something else. But like Angular is pretty modular anyways, and so I feel like that will almost never happen. Like you'll never really have ripple effects which are too deep. Also, another thing is that project requirements change. So like if you're freelancing for somebody, or you're like working at a job, once you start building the thing that they want you to build, they might realize, oh, well, I want it to be this way instead. And if you're testing all the way along, or heaven forbid you're doing test-driven development, then you have like twice as much overhead. So tests should be written last, in my opinion, almost always. And then the last point I kind of already mentioned, front-end tests are usually not critical. The front end is just for looks. The front end, as an Angular app, it is delivered to the user, and like the user can change any of that. It's on their browser. If they want to change anything, they can do it if they really wanted to. So front-end tests are really not super important. I do think it's nice if you're part of a growing team and you need to make sure that new members don't break existing code or something like that. Might be useful, but if you're like a solo dev or you're an entrepreneur, then tests should be the last thing on your mind. It's just too much overhead. Yeah, so those are just all my opinions, you guys. Those are the things which I've learned over over a decade of programming. Some of you may have different opinions, but hey, we're all just perceptrons. We're all just learning different things. This is what I've learned. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you'll subscribe for more videos just like this one, and it really helps support the channel if you did. So if you haven't already, click that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.